Welcome to Dr. Jeremy England, renowned physicist, former professor of physics at MIT, author of Every Life is on Fire, currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel. Shana Tova and Gemar Chatima Tova.
Chatima Tova. So following the theme of the beginning of the New Year season with Rosh Hashanah, and the reading on Rosh Hashanah of the parasha about Akedah Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, I thought it would be appropriate to make some comments about Har Moriah and how we understand Har Moriah, the Temple Mount, Mount Moriah. Just trying to pull different things primarily out of Chumash, out of the 5 books of Moses, but also Tanakh, and see if there are some things that are not directly on the surface that might be interesting to reflect on, and give us some broader sense of the significance of this particular place, this particular mountain, because we, in the present day, obviously relate to Har Moriah, to the Temple Mount, as Har HaBayit, as the place where the temples stood, and where B'ezrat Hashem we will again have sacrificial service and all that our tradition teaches us is commanded to be done there. However, it is also possible to ask, how is this place, this mountain, understood narratively? And obviously there isn't a whole lot of data to work with in the Torah, but we do have a little bit, because it is mentioned in the life of Avraham Avinu, in the time of the binding of Isaac. And there are a few different things that can be said about this, especially if we pull together a few other details from other places in Tanakh that are sort of further down the line, but give us commentaries that maybe magnify some perspectives that are hiding, very deeply in the Torah itself. So I think this breaks into a few different vignettes. I'm not sure that they're connected. And the first and briefest, but maybe the most important one, has to do with Corban Pesach, the Paschal offering, which is going to be the easiest offering to bring back, because by design, in a sense, it's just, since it's modeled after this moment of the Exodus from Egypt, of Yetziat Mitzrayim, when the people were doing things b'chipazon, in haste, and just sort of cobbling together a korban in their homes at the time that prepared them to leave Mitzrayim. Korban Pesach has that element to it as well, where it's easier to make it happen than some of the other things that happen as part of all the different mitzvot of the Mishkan and the Mikdash, of the tabernacle and the temple. But I think, if you look at contemporary discussions about Corban Pesach, there's actually an interesting parallel that you can find in the text of the Torah itself, which I think really exposes the prophetic inside of the text, that you could imagine happening today, like kind of a debate or a discussion that's very contemporary, having to do with Corban Pesach and the Temple Mount. And this really relates in a sense to a personal experience of mine. Like, I've been at a Seder Shel Pesach, a Passover Seder. This was in the United States, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago or something like that, where there was some kind of discussion, in the middle of reading the Akedah. And I may have made some comment about, eagerness to see Am Yisrael again perform Korban Pesach, and someone else who was present at the time made some kind of comment like, well, but we can't really do that because of the opposition and the people who are quote unquote already there, and I think that one should take seriously as possible, give the most credit possible to a Jewish perspective that would try to say, well, hang on a minute, maybe we need to be careful about this, because it's very easy to say, well, look, this is a mitzvah from the Torah. Obviously, Hakadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do it, so we should do it. And if there are difficulties associated with that, then we'll be strong and brave and push onward, and we'll figure it out. And you can have that kind of attitude, and that's I think a very appropriate way to approach things. But nonetheless, I don't think that should make one casually dismissive of someone who tries with sincerity to say, well, look, aren't there other values and considerations that are part of our tradition that we should consider? Like, for example, as you frequently hear in these kinds of discussions, pikuach nefesh, like what if there's a danger to life associated with trying to do this thing? So yes, it's a mitzvah to take a lamb, a seh, and slaughter it on Har HaBayit and make roasted lamb and eat it with matzah and maror and do the whole set of mitzvot associated with Pesach. And those are mitzvot of the Torah. And even someone who would say, like, sure, let's try to do all the mitzvot of the Torah, but they would also say, well, we have in the Torah and in our extended tradition this idea of v'chai b'hem, that you should live by the Torah, and if something is dangerous to life, then you shouldn't be doing it. So like you would push off keeping Shabbat in order to save a life, etc. And so they might say, okay, well, look, right now it's dangerous to do Corban Pesach. And granted, it's dangerous because of other people who make it dangerous. But if we kind of take that as a given situation and we say, well, won't it be the case that there will be innocent lives of Jews that might be lost, chas v'chalila, because we tried to do this thing, and because of that risk to life, we should just say, no, not right now, and perhaps not for a while, because the same reason that we would offer has been in place for centuries at this point, and so it's not necessarily assumed to be likely to change anytime soon. So we'd be really putting things off indefinitely. And it's a legitimate question, but I think so. You could argue it in halachic terms, meaning like look at issues in Jewish law and really ask the question: is pikuach nefesh, is the saving of life, an appropriate principle to invoke here? And I think it could be argued on its face that the answer is no, because you can make the same argument against ever, for example, fighting a war, right? Like that people will die in war, and so instead of fighting in war, you should just submit to the demands of your enemies, no matter what they are. So the concept of saving life, pikuach nefesh, in halacha has to be bounded and studied carefully, and we can't just use it to veto and cancel whatever we want. So that's the first point. But even if we don't go that direction, others can and have or can make and have made that argument better than I could. There's a narrative way of looking at this that I think that the Torah itself takes up, because if you look at the binding of Isaac, Akedah Yitzchak, what's interesting is that, first of all, there are many elements of it that evoke the moment of Corban Pesach in Mitzrayim, the first Corban Pesach, the first Paschal offering. And some of this is subtextual, or you look at particular words. So lo chasachta et bincha yichidcha mimeni. So you didn't withhold your son from me. When Hashem is saying to Avram, it is to your merit that you haven't withheld your son. The verb to withhold is chasach, and the letters chet sin chaf evoke choshech, chet shin chaf, which is one of the plagues at the end of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Or there's also like a promise to magnify Avraham's seed afterwards. Like I will magnify I'll make many your descendants. So arbe is the word for locusts. And then of course, Yitzchak himself is a firstborn, and there's been a threat to his life. So it's like a firstborn son whose life is threatened. And you have this mention of Choshech, and you have this mention of arbe, so like darkness and locusts. And so there's the elements of the last three plagues in Yetziat Mitzrayim that are coming up there. And also, of course, there's a lamb. Ayeh haseh la'olah. Where's the lamb for the offering? Is what Yitzchak asks. Now, it's an olah, so we can talk about that in a moment. It doesn't quite match up because Corban Pesach is not an olah. An olah is an offering that's totally burnt up. But there is a way of repairing that aspect of things, but I'll put that in like the second vignette. The point is, though, you have a sacrificial lamb and a firstborn son, and maybe subtextual references to locusts and darkness. So there's a lot of stuff to do with Corban Pesach there. And what is it that Akadosh Baruch Hu is saying to Avraham? He's saying, take Yitzchak, your one, your only, your beloved. I mean, not in that order, but and take him to Eretz Moriah, take him to this place in what's going to be Har Moriah, v'ha'aleu sham le'olah. And usually it's translated as make a burnt offering of him. But ha'aleu could also maybe mean take him up there for an offering. And so it's exactly this kind of scenario where it's say, Hashem is asking Abraham to take his son up to Har Moriah to do service there, to perform a sacrificial act. And there's this ambiguity about whether that poses a danger to Yitzchak. It maybe puts Yitzchak in the position of the sacrifice himself, meaning, and that would in a sense be the accusation of the, let's say, well-meaning but very cautious person who doesn't want Corban Pesach to be something that the Jews are doing anytime soon, because they would say, what are you going to do? Are you going to take, so to speak, your innocent son and put him on the sacrificial altar? Are you, that out of your devotion to Akadosh Baruch Hu, are you going to sacrifice your child because you're going to bring about this violence that could kill your child, Has v'Chalila, or someone else's, and all for the sake of this mitzvah? And so the performance of Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, in a sense is a prefiguration of exactly the scenario in which we find ourselves, where someone can argue that you are, in a sense, making a kind of a human sacrifice by insisting on the performance of Corban Pesach. And that has to be something that gives one pause, and at least you should stop and ask whether is that a legitimate accusation? Because of course, if it really is, in a sense, a case of human sacrifice, you would say, no, we don't do that. We've been taught very firmly by our Torah that we don't act that way. We don't do things that involve human sacrifice. However, I think narratively, this same passage provides the response to that argument. Because first of all, ha'aleu sham le'olah, like that you should take him up for an offering, the ambiguity of that is not something that, it's very strained to read into the text. The Midrash Rabbah identifies this ambiguity and sort of plays with it and suggests that maybe Akadosh Baruch Hu was just, he never was suggesting that Yitzchak would be sacrificed. And it's a Midrash, and it would not be fair to the text to say, oh yeah, we should never translate this to suggest that Yitzchak should be an offering. Obviously, part of the point is that there is that ambiguity, but the point is that it is an ambiguity. It's not 100% clear that Akadosh Baruch Hu is demanding Yitzchak's blood from Abraham, and Abraham has to decide what to do in the space of that ambiguity. Meaning that what he could say is, well, if there's even a 1% chance that what you mean is that this could be the blood of Yitzchak, then I'm just going to ignore it. I won't do those mitzvot. I won't keep that part of the Torah. I won't follow those commands of my Creator. And alternatively, and this is what Avraham does, he says, okay, I may not get all that this means or all that it adds up to right now, but I will go on the path as far as I can, according to my understanding, and I'll trust that the way that it will happen will ultimately make sense given what else I know about HaKadosh Baruch Hu and how I trust in him. And indeed, that's what happens, right? When Yitzchak asks Avraham, Ayaseh le'olah, where's the lamb for the offering? Avraham doesn't say simply, oh no, there is no lamb, we're going to sacrifice you. He actually says, Hashem yireh, like he says that Hashem will provide for the lamb, right? And so if we're taking him at his word, then he actually anticipates the resolution of this, which is they go up, and there actually isn't a lamb, but there's an ayil that has its horns caught in a thicket, and that animal ends up being the sacrifice. So, in a sense, Abraham trusted that things would work out, and they got to the right place eventually. And the right place was an unexpected outcome, right? Because the expected outcome was this will bring disaster. This will bring about the death of Yitzchak. And what the Torah is teaching us, I think, and this is relevant to the contemporary debate that started off this discussion, is that this is an instance where you have emunah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is actually steering the ship, and that this can lead to a different place than you expect it to, that it seems like it must. That sometimes when we run calculations and we say, it absolutely must be the case that if we do X, then Y must follow, and therefore we can't do X because of the certainty of the Y that we bring about, that sometimes we're being overly clever and we're saying we understand exactly who these people are and what these kind of events will do to bring about, certain responses, etc. If you look at what actually happens with the ayil, what is an ayil? An ayil is a ram, and the ram with its horns, what are the horns for? The horns are for fighting, right? And this is so much the case that the ram in other symbolic structures of the ancient Near East is associated with war frequently, right? Because rams run at each other and bang their horns together. And so it's an emblem of conflict. But this idea of war and of conflict and of danger is being represented in a ram whose horns get caught in a thicket, and the ram ends up becoming the sacrifice, right? So in the end, the resolution of this is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Abraham, since he showed this emunah, since he didn't withhold his son from Hashem, the son doesn't become the sacrifice. And Hashem doesn't demand the blood of your children. He doesn't want human sacrifice. What he wants is for you to trust in him. And if you trust in him in the right way, then the ram, the war, the danger, it doesn't go the way you expect. The war actually gets its horns, so to speak, caught in the thicket and ends up being eliminated from the picture. And I don't want to presume that I know, the way that that's supposed to go, right? It can go in a lot of different unexpected directions. It might be, for example, that people who seem bent on war actually might become less bent on war if the most potent symbol that motivates their warlikeness were to some degree repurposed by the act of Corban Pesach, right? That as long as Am Yisrael are not laying claim to Har HaBayit and are not doing things there, Har HaBayit mostly serves as a talisman for whipping up war against Am Yisrael. But that could change, and it might change as a result of the fact that Am Yisrael started to lay claim and make use of the place in the proper way according to the Torah. So that's one scenario. There are other scenarios that you could imagine, but the point is that one way or another, this fear you have of war and the idea that because of war you can't do this, the Torah is saying things can turn out differently than you expect. And Yitzhak is not actually the sacrifice ultimately in this scenario, that ultimately you perform the animal sacrifice on Har HaBayit, and the emblem of war is mitigated, is removed from the picture relative to status quo beforehand. So that's one reading. I think the only point I want to make in that vignette is that when we talk about Corban Pesach, we should see it as an opportunity to show emunah, to trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to trust that this mitzvah is not given to us so that we can show that we're willing to perform endless amounts of human sacrifices out of devotion to him, but rather that our unwillingness to do this mitzvah may actually lead more in that direction, and that the war that we fear may actually be in part exacerbated and driven and agitated by our refusal to ascend the mount and start trying to do there what we've been commanded to. And this is, to me, a striking thing to see in the text of the Torah, because it seems to be more relevant to today than any period I can imagine beforehand, particularly with regard to this question of Corban Pesach and kind of the risks associated with taking hold of it. So that's a first vignette. The second point, which I think might be kind of a short one, it revolves around this issue of the lamb, and this line from Yitzchak, Hayeh haseh le'olah. Where is the lamb for the offering? But it's not just an olah, it's not just an offering, it's an olah, which is a total elevation offering, meaning that the whole thing goes up in smoke. So if you do an olah, then at the end, you don't have an animal that you can eat or that the Kohanim eat, like with shlamim or chatat. You just have smoke and ashes. And that is not the case for Corban Pesach, right? Because Corban Pesach, you're supposed to eat. People eat the roasted lamb. Ordinary people, not even just the Kohanim, eat the roasted lamb. So Corban Pesach is not an olah. So why is Yitzchak saying Ayaseh le'olah, that we're going to do an olah? And I think to get somewhere here, you have to follow the tradition that Chazal established of looking at the actions of the Avot and assuming that their world is guided by the mitzvot of the Torah that we know. And this is, of course, kind of an artifice that helps us to study things in the Torah. It's, I think, and there are other examples of this. The Midrash suggests, for example, that when Yaakov Avinu and Yosef were last together before Yosef was kidnapped, they were studying the mitzvah of Eglah Erufa. Now, this is almost comically weird because the mitzvah of Eglah Erufa is saying, if there's a city and another city and there is a dead body found in between them and no one knows where the body came from, then the Kohanim come and the judges come. It's a mitzvah that assumes the existence of a highly populated Jewish society. And it is very difficult to conceive of how it could be that Yosef and Yaakov are talking about this as though they've already received 613 mitzvot from Moshe at Sinai, but it serves a purpose when Chazal invite us to view the Avot as though they live in a world that is shaped by the Torah that their nation will eventually be given. And so one might not be bold enough to engage in this kind of activity if Chazal had not already established it for us, but since they have, I think it's also interesting to do this in the case of the lamb that's being asked about by Yitzchak, because there's actually not just only a lamb being asked about, but there's another animal in the picture because of the way that Avraham and Yitzchak arrive there. They arrive with some youths, some Na'arim who are assisting them, which the tradition says are Ishmael and Eliezer, where they don't need to be. But the point is, in the Torah itself, Avraham says, Shvu lechem po im ha'chamor, v'ani v'anar nerchad ko v'nishtachave v'nashuv alechem. So stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go up and we'll bow and worship and return to you. So there's a mention of a donkey, a chamor. And I don't think that actually this chamor is itself what I'm going, the kind of chamor that's needed for the mitzvah that I'm about to refer to. I'm talking about it more in sort of a mashup of elements. You have a seh referred to on the one hand, a lamb. On the other hand, you have a chamor. So when are a seh and a chamor put together in the Torah? There's a specific mitzvah that's quite relevant to Akedah Yitzchak, where that comes up, because it's about the fact that all peterechem belongs to Hashem, that all the first issue of the womb belongs to Hashem. So that includes the bechor, the ben bechor, the firstborn son, and you have to do a pidyon haben for a firstborn son. And also, there's a specific mitzvah mentioned for a chamor in the Torah, that if you have a donkey and it has a firstborn offspring donkey, then you have to redeem it. You have to do a pidyon. But you can't do that by making an offering out of the donkey, because the donkey is not a kosher animal. So it says tifteh b'seh. You should redeem it with a lamb. And if you don't have a lamb, then you actually have to, I guess, break the donkey's neck or cut off its head. It says wa'afto. So there is this juxtaposition of the idea of a donkey and the lamb, and the lamb is to be used to redeem the donkey. So if we're engaging in this activity, we can imagine, and maybe this seems far-fetched, that Avraham and Yitzhak are doing the mitzvah of a pidyon for a donkey, right? Like there's some like firstborn donkey that was born, and so they have to bring aseh as an olah on Har Habayit in order to redeem the donkey. And so, all right, that might work mathematically, so to speak, if you follow all the sort of stretches required to get to this point. But the question now is, what does that mean? What's the point of that? Aside from the fact that it kind of references the general idea of the firstborn and the striking of the firstborn and the stuff we were talking about before with Yetziat Mitzrayim. And I think there what you have to focus on now, and this leads us into the rest of the discussion, is what kind of a place is Har Habayit? And what kind of an animal is a donkey, and what do they have to do with each other? So I think that just focusing on the donkey part first, in contrast with lambs and cows, donkeys in the concept of the world of the Torah, they're only a means, right? They're not a product or they're not currency in a sense, except insofar as they're capital, right? What can you use a donkey for? You can ride it from place to place, or you can hitch it to something and use it for work. But that's a means to something. You're trying to transport things. You're trying to move things and do work, or you're trying to, change the world in some way. But you're not shearing the donkey for its wool, or you're not drinking the wool, the milk, or eating the meat. It isn't itself the wealth or the thing that you kind of enjoy or consume. It's just a means to these other things that you might need to do for trade or for agriculture, or pushing something. And insofar as that's the case, the donkey is much more so just a substitute for a person, right? Like it's just doing things that you would do. It just does them better, or it's convenient to have a donkey do them instead of you because it's strong and it can push a yoke, or you can ride it from place to place. So you could have walked from place to place. You could have carried some things from one place to another. You could have pushed a yoke yourself, and it's all very, painful, backbreaking labor, and you don't want to do it, so you would use a donkey instead. And so I think that the significance of this is that when a donkey has this firstborn, that we have to do this pidyon, we have to bring an offering that ends up being that we bring a lamb instead. And what that substitution does is it calls our attention to, in a sense, the need to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim at this moment where you get another donkey, right? Like your donkey's wealth, so to speak, is capital for you to make yourself richer. Like if you have a donkey that gives birth to another donkey, then now you have two donkeys, and you can pull more plows, and you can transport things more from place to place. And because it's purely a means, there's this sense in which it's just kind of making you stronger and more powerful. And you're becoming more, let's say, impressed with your own ability to shape the world to your own ends. And the need to bring an olah, that is a seh, that is a lamb, which the word seh always immediately evokes Corban pesach and reminds you of Yetziat Mitzrayim, reminds you of this moment when Bnei Yisrael were the means, right? We were the donkeys. We were the labor that was moving things from place to place, that was pulling the yoke. And so instead of just exulting in your greater power to force the world into the shape that you want it to be in, and using the donkey as sort of the slave labor for that, which is okay, right? Like it's a donkey, and that is, according to the Torah, an acceptable use of a donkey. But at that moment where your capacity to do that increases, and when the donkey has its firstborn, you're reminded, because of the firstborn, because of the seh, to think back to Yetziat Mitzrayim, and really about how you were the means, and there is something different that actually matters more than just producing material abundance by having the ability to do a bunch of mechanical work. And Yetziat Mitzrayim is all about that, right? That it's about not serving Paro with your physical strength until the backbreaking labor kills you, but instead serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu and finding the only freedom that there is in the world by being an Oved Hashem and wanting to serve Him and letting Him teach you how to be free with His commandments, so that by serving Him you discover true freedom. So I think there is also this aspect hiding in the background of Akedah Yitzchak because of this moment, where they're talking about the donkey and the seh and the lamb, that locates for us a theme that's a bit hiding in the background. That's about kind of the material means of making the world more abundant. And what people should be willing to give in order to create that abundance, and making sure that you don't become obsessed with the narrow means of producing that abundance, but instead you remember HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you remember that He liberated you from slavery. And that's a highly significant point when you're thinking about your abundance and wanting food and bracha and agricultural success, because that really goes all the way back to Cain and Hevel, right? Cain and Hevel we think of as one brother who murders another brother. But there's this element, if you look at the whole story, of Cain is a farmer, and he makes an offering to Hashem that Hashem isn't so keen on. And one worry that Cain might have is that he somehow didn't give enough, that he didn't make the land productive enough. And the productivity of the land is a theme running from before with Adam and afterwards, after he kills Hevel. So this is not like a sidebar. So there's this strange thing where it's, Vayomer Cain el Hevel, and he spoke to Hevel, but it doesn't say, he said to him, but it doesn't say what he said. And then it just describes that he kills Hevel. And the language is very strange when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is excoriating Cain for killing Hevel. He says, Arura ha'adama asher patzta et piha, like cursed is the ground that opened her mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand, which is not just a murder, but it sounds more like a sacrificial offering, as though the ground is this kind of goddess that's being propitiated, right? Like it's a sacrificial act almost. And a sacrificial act involving worship of the earth, like a chthonic sacrifice. So what does that have to do with the donkey and the seh and making the land productive? I think the point is that there's an element in Cain and Hevel that really is a prefiguration of everything that the Torah is about with regard to Yetziat Mitzrayim. Because what it's saying is that there will always be the temptation for man to make the earth more productive by, in a sense, killing his brother. And in Mitzrayim, that had a very clear direct causal mechanism, because it was about working your brother to death in the fields in order to make the land productive. Right? Mitzrayim was this pyramid built where like Paro is at the top, and he's telling everyone else what to do. And the people on the bottom of the pyramid are the slaves who are just being ground to dust in the mud. But because the system exploits labor in that way, it's capable of all this greatness. It's capable of building pyramids. It's capable of creating all of this wealth, all of this agricultural productivity. And so, human sacrifice to the earth, it sounds very pointless and pagan and magical from this remove in a society that doesn't, thankfully, see a whole lot of activity explicitly of that kind anymore. But I think that underestimates what pagan cults were really trying to do. It's not just about a false belief that magic works. It's about what that shows to people, right? That if you are willing to spill innocent blood in order to make the ground more productive, and you show people that through a ritual sacrifice, then what you're saying is, look, in this society, what we value is we'll kill people in order to make the ground productive. And there actually are very good ways of killing people to make the ground productive. You just have to whip them and lash them to yokes and make them pull things around. And yes, they'll die, but the ground will be more productive. So the sacrificial ritual serves the purpose of creating a symbolic ideological framework for a society that accepts a pharaonic slave system that is exactly the type of system that the Torah is trying to reject and overturn and explode and demolish and everything else. So I think that theme ties back also to this idea of the chamor, the donkey that's hiding in the background at Akedah Yitzchak, that there is this element of remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim when you're going to the place that is the source of all bracha, right? Because we do relate to Har HaBayit as the source of bracha. We have all of our agricultural festivals focused on this place, and going to meet Hashem and stand before our Maker at these moments of great agricultural significance that we have throughout the year. And perhaps the best evidence from the elsewhere in Tanakh that this reading of Chumash, which is granted kind of thin and tendentious just based on Chumash itself, the best evidence from Tanakh that this is a fair reading is that if you go elsewhere, you say, what is Har HaBayit, right? What kind of a place was it? Was it just a random empty hill that Abraham had to go to? That seems kind of strange. Like, why would he do that? I mean, you can imagine he's wandering in a completely empty wilderness and some sign is given to him by Hashem. It's like, okay, on that hill. But why on that hill? Well, not that many years later. I mean, relative to now, obviously it was still centuries later, but we actually have, in the time of David HaMelech, a comment both from Divrei Yamim and also from Sefer Shmuel about what Har HaBayit actually was. It was a goren. It was a threshing floor. It was a place where wheat was threshed, so that you're in the midst of the process of taking your sheaves of wheat that you've cut down, and you're going to thresh it, and then you're going to afterwards all do the winnowing and all this stuff, wheat from the chaff, and then you get your pile of grain at the end, and you find out how much food you actually have. So any place that was where you were going to count how much food you had to eat for the rest of the year, you might imagine in a pagan context is going to become the center of Avodah Zarah, right? You're going to do worship of the gods there because you're going to try to get all the good luck that you can so that when your agricultural bounty is finally measured, you'll find out, oh, you know what? We have this much, but if we do a little pagan magic, then maybe we can have this much more. Maybe if we perform a little human sacrifice, we'll have all that much more, et cetera, et cetera. Like that would be the sort of Canaanite way of going about this. And so for the Jebusites, the Yevusim, like when Arwana or Onan, the Yevusi, when he sells Har HaBayit to David HaMelech, it is called a goren. It's a threshing floor. So this, I would argue, is evidence that this really was a place already of significance, right? And perhaps a place of centrality for some, Amorite society or whatever else was there, pre-existing. That could have actually been a place of worship and even a place of sacrifice, but associated specifically with the idea of agricultural productivity. And when you're threshing, you might be using animal labor for that. You might be using human labor for that. But the point is, it's about like turning labor into agricultural productivity. And so you're going to take that place in the Torah and you're going to turn it into something new. You're going to transform it into a place that has a different purpose, because Har HaBayit is not a place where we, force people to work or where we count our grain, but it is a place where we come to meet HaKadosh Baruch Hu and we bring the bounty that the land has created to him, to show our gratitude and a lot of other things besides. And just one last point. I don't know if this is like fully a third vignette or a related one. Getting back to how this relates to Akedah Yitzchak, I do think there's another element in Tanakh that plugs into a few different other pieces of the puzzle that we've been playing with here. So the basic point that we just made is maybe Har HaBayit was, in a pre-Torah sense, some place that had to do with agricultural bounty, and then it gets repurposed or transformed according to Hashem's command, and that shows the shift away from the donkey and towards the lamb. Like, so you're remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim instead of remembering your means to producing, greater agricultural wealth. But there's also another element of what's going on in Akedah Yitzchak, which we could look at in the end of the parasha, which is, it seems totally unrelated to the story, where after Hashem says, okay, you're going to have all these brachot as a result of the fact that you didn't withhold your son from me, there suddenly is, and some word was brought to Abraham about Betuel and Milcah and like his relatives back in, Padan Aram or Haran or wherever, and that Rivka exists and she could be a wife for Yitzchak. And what that points to is that something in the background here was also about this question of whom Yitzchak was going to marry. And so the last thing I'll say, I guess this is a third vignette, and it's maybe the most tendentious, but I think it's interesting to raise as a question, is that if you also ask the question about Akedah Yitzchak from a different direction, what is the mitzvah in the Torah that would come closest to vindicating Abraham in a scenario where he is bringing Yitzchak somewhere to be killed? Like, that sounds very disturbing, but you want to give Abraham credit and say, like, according to the Torah, is there anything the Torah teaches us that would sound like what Abraham is doing? And you realize, okay, there is one mitzvah that is a little bit like child sacrifice, and that is the mitzvah of the rebellious son, right? It's not a sacrifice, it's not like a gift to Hashem, but it is a mitzvah that the Torah describes, where it says, if you have a son who is, a drunkard or sits and eats all day, a ben sorer umore, then you can bring him to the gates and to the people and say, my son is a ben sorer umore, and then the people can stone them and all of that. The parents can do this. And then you think, like, well, who would actually do that? And Chazal say that, I believe Chazal say no one ever did it. But nonetheless, it's there in the Torah as a mitzvah. And it is a mitzvah where a parent brings his child somewhere that, according to the Torah, there's a proper mechanism for that progeny to be put to death because of his actions, because of who he's become. And I do note that he's called a ben sorer umore, which is interesting. It's not exactly Moriah, but it is a very close resemblance to Moriah. And then once you pick up on that theme, the word more as connected to Moriah, there are a few other places that this comes up, and it starts to pull together into a theme that connects a few different things. So the first place Avraham Avinu arrives when he comes to Eretz Canaan is Elon Moreh, which is Har Barcha, it's Shechem, it's that area. And it's interesting that in that area, you have an instance also where it's about rebellious sons like Shimon and Levi fighting in Shechem, and Dinah, because of the rape of Dinah, it's also about intermarriage with Canaanites. Then you go over to another use of the word Moreh in Tanakh, and it's talking about Shimshon and how he never shaved his head. And the word for a razor, saying a razor never went on his scalp, is Moreh. It's used. And if you look at Shimshon, where does he end up in the end? He ends up, so he lives his life in Gaza, engaging in all of this intermarriage with Canaanites. And he settles at the end in a situation where his eyes are gouged out, so he's blind like Yitzchak, and he's yoked to a sort of plow type thing, and he's in a threshing floor. So the theme of threshing floor and intermarriage in Gaza and being blind like Yitzchak all come together. And then you go look at Yitzchak himself, and what was the situation with Yitzchak? The pasuk before the binding of Isaac that we're told is that Avram lived in the land of the Plishtim for a long time, the same way that Shimshon did. And there's this question of, like, where's that going to end? Like, if you raise your family in Beersheba or in even closer to Gaza, which is where Avraham was, where the Plishtim were, at what point does that start to become, oh, well, whom is Yitzchak going to marry? The natural thing would be for him to marry a Plishtite woman, because what else is there? But if he's becoming part of that society, then at what point is he regarded as this sort of rebellious son who has gone so far off the rails that now the Torah teaches us there's a scenario in which there's kind of an enmity that can develop because of how far the son has gone from keeping to the ways of the Torah. So, pulling all those things together, I think that if you look at Shimshon as this lens through which you're seeing a reference to the blindness of Yitzchak eventually, but also the threshing floor that is Har Moriah, and the word Moreh that's appearing, in describing Shimshon and his dalliances with Plishtaite women, and maybe that is all kind of like more detailed than you actually are getting on the life of Yitzchak. You can imagine that there's kind of a backstory with Yitzchak that could suggest somehow that Avraham, like in the time of the Akedah, a legitimate reason for him to be bringing Yitzchak somewhere to kill him would be if Yitzchak was kind of going off the rails to such a degree that he was becoming part of the Plishti society. And I'm not saying, oh yeah, that's definitely the explanation. That's what was happening. I think the Torah kind of hints at these things in the background to give us a chance to ruminate about them and teach us something. And I would just note in completing the point that this element of the threshing floor is also still there in the story of Shimshon, where he's being, he's the one pushing the yoke around in a circle. And I think that is a significant point, because what it points to is this temptation of, intermarriage, the foreign woman. That's a theme that's bigger than just an issue of marital politics in Tanakh. What it's really about is the constant temptation to idol worship and the constant temptation to approaching the world as other societies approach the world, because there seem to be significant technical advantages in that. And that it's not actually such an easy choice to make, to say, oh, I don't need the means of other societies to make the land fertile. I can just trust in Hashem, because there's a very blurry border between a technique that seems to work and an idolatrous magic that you hope works. So I think in the end, in this third vignette, which maybe connects with the second one, what it becomes about is the question of, could it be the case that, in this founding moment for Har Moriah, that there's some recognition in the text that we face a constant temptation to idolatry or to sort of foreign dalliance in the way that we relate to Har Moriah, because to the degree that we trust in Hashem that He will give us bracha, that He'll bless the land, we always are at risk of either using our relationship with Hashem insincerely as a kind of form of magic to try to make the land more fertile, which is one way of going off the rails and being idolatrous, or instead to turning away from Hashem so that we can try to make the land more fertile by using, so to speak, the technologies of other societies, and really therefore adopting their values and believing in their standards instead of our own, in order to get the prosperity that comes with it, which is obviously the much more current issue in the present era, and really has also been one, throughout the millennia. So those are the different points that I thought would be interesting to raise about Har Moriah in this season following our reading of Akedah Yitzchak.
I found it inspiring during the course of your presentation to absorb the value of Bitchon b'Hashem, trust in Hashem, even when things are not exactly certain how things are going to turn out. But when you have Bitchon b'Hashem, things just may turn out for the best.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's a point that I've tried to make before about Akedah Yitzchak, that is more likely to be the case if you stay open and you listen, meaning that Avram changes course, and so Yitzchak is saved because Avram, once he gets to the mountain, he sees a different opportunity than one might have anticipated, and that is assigned to him, and then the ayil, the ram, becomes the Corban. And so I think the point is that if you say, like, I trust in Hashem, and I also know how things are going to play out, and so my trust in Hashem is that I have certainty about my vision of the future being guaranteed, then I think that can lead to trouble. But what we're being modeled in the example of Abraham is instead this idea of bitachon, or emunah in Hakadosh Baruch Hu, in trust or faith in Hakadosh Baruch Hu, where you go step by step and you take some steps that seem like you don't understand how they could be leading to a safe place or to the right place, but you feel sure that those are the ones that he's taught you, and so you take them. But then you have to kind of check and listen and make sure that he's helping you to understand that you're on the right path, because he might actually, even at the last minute, sort of divert you and say, like, he needed to kind of draw you forward this far with a certain notion in your mind of what you were doing. But then once you get to the mountain, it's like, no, actually we're going over and doing things with this ram now instead of what you thought you were here to do. And that, I think, is relevant even to the contemporary discussion, meaning that I don't think with something as momentous as this that anyone should have a crystal clear idea in their mind of, like, how are we supposed to untie all the knots of rejuvenating and resurrecting the mitzvot of the Mishkan and the Mikdash. There are provisional ideas you could have about how to get started, and so you take those steps, and it might be, one might be, B'ezrat Hashem, pleasantly surprised at how easy certain other pieces become once you take those initial steps, and that there's kind of an expected bitterness to bringing about change in that situation that might be not necessary if we're willing to take the first steps, be'emunah, with a trust and a faith.
Right, this also brings us to the topic of the Torah being real as opposed to something, some religious Jews sort of just walk the walk in certain types of ways, but don't really think the think, or talk the talk in a certain type of way. In other words, they don't really take the Torah seriously as something that's supposed to be guiding our lives, both as individuals and as a nation. And then that brings us to the topic of how are we supposed to be conducting ourselves as a nation. All too often, even those leaders who have shown themselves to be competent in different ways are not being guided by a sense of, well, what is it Hashem wants me to do, and how am I going to make the Torah work in real life? It's sort of just using logic, common sense, taking into account reality, but not taking into account the Torah's dictates.
Yeah. Well, I think that, this is something that could be the subject of a longer shiur, but there's, I think on the one hand, there's good sense in not relating to the Torah as though it's a sort of a cheat sheet for the universe, where if you just do the things that Hakadosh Baruch Hu commands, then you're magically protected and magically successful, and there's no rhyme or reason to why or how, but you, so to speak, get to toss heads 25 times in a row with a coin, just because you're on a mission from heaven, and it all works out. On the one hand, I think theologically speaking, one has to affirm that, of course, if Hakadosh Baruch Hu wants to do things that way, he's not limited or constrained in any sense. So there may be times when there isn't like a better way of explaining or describing how events have played out. And you just say, well, there was an amazingness that Hashem made for us, and we can't comprehend it. And he sort of stacked the deck in our favor and did it, because of our merits. And I would never want to suggest that Hashem is any way barred or restrained in the degree to which he can put his hand on the scale in the world in ways that we can't anticipate. However, I think what's also true is that empirically it seems he's reluctant to do that. Like, he prefers not to do that unless there's great merit and great need. And if he can get away with bringing about what he wants to in a way that seems more explainable or natural, then he errs in that direction. And there are, I think, epistemological and theological reasons that it would make sense that he would want, to approach things that way. And so, to the degree that that's the case, I think part of what is referenced, there's a pasuk which I'm not going to be able to quote directly from memory in Sefer Dvarim, that says that the Torah is like, it will be in our hands, like it will be chokhmah for the nations around us, like wisdom. And I think that people don't necessarily always read enough into that statement. Like, what is chokhmah? Chokhmah is the sort of the craftsman's knowledge of how the world works, meaning like, if you heat metal to this temperature, it will melt, and then you can pour it into this shape, et cetera, et cetera. And to say that the Torah in the eyes of the Goyim can be like chokhmah, it's saying there is a craftsman's rationale to why it's all expected to work, meaning that when the Torah promises you something like that, there will be bracha in the 6th year to cover the 7th year when you refrain from surplus cash cropping agriculture in Shemitah or something like that, that this is not saying there will be magically, twice as many or 3 times as many crops in the 6th year, and there's no explanation or reason why, and you can just say thank you. If the Torah is teaching us that there is chokhmah behind this, then it means like we can understand to some degree like what the Torah is talking about. And I happen to think in the case of Shemitah, for example, that at least part of what it's saying is that when you cultivate a society that is capable of lifting its eyes from backbreaking subsistence agriculture for a year every 7 years, you cultivate in the human capital the ability to conceive of how to prosper other ways. And actually, there's a lot of wealth that can be created when you sort of lift your eyes from scrabbling in the dirt or pushing a yoke and start to think about, well, how could this be done more efficiently? Or how could I make something that I could trade with someone and then they could, give me some things that I need instead of my having to produce them myself. And so I think one of the amazing lessons of Shemitah is that when you have this Shabbat of a whole year where you don't act like an ancient society always holding on by its fingernails on the brink of starvation, and you force people to fire drill famine in that way every 7 years, you actually create the room for much more valuable kinds of wealth-producing human capital to germinate. And then you can become a wealthy society and you can import whatever food you need in the 7th and the 8th year and whatever. So and that is certainly how, we live now. We import a lot of food and we're capable of that because we've created a lot of wealth. And if we wanted to keep Shemitah very, very well, B'ezrat Hashem, we could, because we have the wealth to get vegetables from Uruguay if we want. And that is part of the lesson of Shemitah. So I think that's an example of how there's a chokhmah to mitzvot that don't necessarily, you don't want to wait until you understand that chokhmah in order to keep them. It's a chokhmah for the goyim, it's not for us. But for someone looking from the outside, there's an objective sense in which things in the Torah make sense, if you look at them carefully enough. And I think that by the same token, I wouldn't say like with Har HaBayit or anything to do with that, if we have enough bitachon, we'll be magically protected and there's no understanding how. But I do think that getting to your point, that there are a lot of people who advocate for keeping the Torah, but then when they look at when they reason about how the world works, they say there are practical considerations to how the world works, and we're totally bound by them. But then often those considerations are much more based on kind of theories, like complicated theories that come from outside of our tradition of how the world works, and they still feel totally constrained by them. And so they'll say, well, we can't do X, we can't do the Corban Pesach because it'll immediately cause this other set of things to happen, and because of Pikuach Nefesh, we can't, or something like that. And I think once you cross that line, what you're doing is you're saying there is no chokhmah to why keeping the Torah should work, and you're denying that should be possible when in fact there are such chokhmot. that are there for us to understand. And then at the same time, you're saying, like, because of a theory of how things work, or even, let's say, a belief system that comes from outside of our tradition, we can't keep the Torah, because our hands are bound. And yeah, I do think that you see that far too often, and you can see it, as you say, like in very much an Orthodox setting, where there's kind of commitment to halakha where it is practically possible, but then the attitude about how the world works does not presume that Hakadosh Baruch Hu is there to be involved in how events play out, and then as a result, we hang back from doing things that he expects of us.
But it was interesting what you were conveying, that there's the possibility of, when we use the technology that's prevalent in the Gentile societies, that we run the risk of importing not only the technology, but also bad cultural aspects that accompany the technology.
Yeah, well, I think that that's a theme that you can find in Tanakh, going very far back. Like, if you look at the nation of Tzor, for example, Tyre, which is it stands for the idea of the Phoenician or seafaring rich people to the north, in Lebanon, etc. They're a very complicated story, because if you read Yechezkel HaNavi, it sounds like they're the bad guy, like, oh, they're so corrupt, they're just obsessed with all of their wealth and their wisdom, and it will be their downfall, and they're going to be, overrun by ravening hordes, and it's because they have worshipped the work of man, and they worship themselves and their own wisdom instead of worshiping God. But also you have, Hiram, who's Melech at a certain time. He's Melech Tzor, and Hiram is a foreign king who is described as the friend of David and of Shlomo, and he provides the cedars that are used to build Beit Rishon, the Beit Mikdash of Shlomo Melech. So he is an essential ingredient in the successful construction of a temple of worship for Hashem, and so a good relationship with the right kind of good neighbor that involves their wealth and technology and all the sort of exchanges that accompany that can be a positive thing. And Chazal even doubled down on this idea by saying about Hira Ha'adulami, the strange Canaanite or whatever friend of Yehuda centuries earlier, that is mentioned in, I think, Parshat Miketz, or maybe not Miketz, sorry, right before that, drawing a blank, Vayeshev, sorry. So that Hiram and Hira are the same person, which obviously is not historically easy to put together if this guy is not going to live for a very, very, very long time. But the point that it's making is that it's talking about the Davidic monarchy is going to be born from the event where Yehuda gets together with Tamar while he's visiting Hira Ha'adulami. So, Mashiach and Beit Mikdash and everything like that comes from this interaction with someone who's kind of from outside the family. And also there's this very complicated situation where, Yehuda is seeing Tamar in a place called Timna, which is interesting because that's also the name of a place where Shimshon is seeing foreign women. And Timna is this place where Yehuda goes to be involved in a very sketchy and seemingly controversial relationship with a woman who's posing as a prostitute. And so there's all of this element of and she's called a Kadesha, which is like a cultic prostitute. So there's this element of foreign idolatry and the temptation of foreign women and intermarriage. It's all the same things that we were just talking about. But Chazal choose to associate that with this positive relationship that David had with Hiram, because I think that they're saying, don't think that you can have the bracha of a wealthy society, a society with great agriculture, a society with healthy people, a society with all the military might that it needs to defend itself. Don't think that you can have that by just closing all the doors and saying it's us against the rest of the world. We want no relationship with the rest of humanity. And because we are so pure in our commitment to Hashem, that we will triumph without them. It's more complicated than that. Both because we have the way that Hashem makes us successful is in part by having the right relationships with other nations, that is a very slippery slope, and it leads to a very treacherous set of mistakes that we can slide down and make if we're not careful, and also because perhaps the point of the Mikdash is ultimately to be a place not just for Am Yisrael but for the whole world, and that again, I guess, in a nice way brings us back to the original point with things maybe going in an unexpected way, that ultimately Be'ezrat Hashem, Har HaBayit will be recognized not only by Jews but also by other people as a place that they can come to worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a proper way. And once there is enough agreement about that, that will be a wonderful thing for it to be a place for the whole world to come and visit. It isn't meant to be a level playing field for all idolatries, and it's not meant to be a sort of emporium for idols where everyone comes and sort of sets up shop and tries to make their own case for how to serve Hashem or whatever other god there. It is meant to be something that's directed and coordinated and built and managed by Am Yisrael according to the Torah. But the invitation to the nations of the world to ultimately participate in that and meet Hashem there and worship Him alongside Am Yisrael, I think is the ultimate hope we have, that all the fear of tampering with the situation there that some people sometimes try to whip up might be a bit misplaced. And it could be that with maybe no difficulty of that kind, but less than we expect, by showing the right commitment to Hashem, we could get to a situation where there's more there that seems to invite the world to peace than we first might anticipate.
Thank you very much, Dr. England.
My pleasure.
And I wish you again a Shana Tova Gama Chatima Tova, in which we hear a lot of positive things for the Jewish people in the world.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.